Centuries of Oppression, The Road to 1918. Chapter 16. The Great Unrest and Men's Demands. To discuss women's demand for the vote in isolation from men's parallel demand is to understand neither. Men's demand for an extended franchise, which meant working class men, is now less prominent in the public mind. The reason is that male working class political action was not focused on that single issue. Male working class politics had become centred on the Labour Party and the trade unions, and also on the more hardline socialist parties, the Independent Labour Party and the Social Democratic Federation. The links between some of the members of these organisations and groups such as the Manhood Suffrage League is noteworthy, demonstrating that extending the male franchise was very much on the agenda, despite its disappearance now from the public memory. But unlike the female suffragists, the proponents of full manhood suffrage did not see this as an end in itself, nor as their sole or even their main policy issue. The main concerns of the Labour Party and the trade unions and other left parties were workers' rights, pay and conditions. Consequently, the direction of travel was different for men and women, but that does not mean that men were unconcerned about the franchise. Far from it. As we shall see later, demands for enfranchisement ultimately saw the women's demands and the men's demands converge. Just as the issues of male and female enfranchisement cannot ultimately be considered separately, so the issue of extending the vote should not be divorced from the broader political picture. Two other matters, at least, were far more pressing for the political class at the time. One was the Home Rule question for Ireland, a matter that constantly threatened civil war. In comparison, a few misbehaving suffragettes were more of an irritation than a problem. The other issue was the Great Unrest. The period from about 1910 to 1914 saw an unprecedented number of strikes. There was more strike action in that period than at any time before or since. In 1911 and 1912, about 10% of the workforce was involved in striking. This was the Great Unrest. The characteristic feature of these strikes was that most were unofficial or wildcat strikes. In other words, they were not approved by the unions, but arose spontaneously. The reasons for the increased labour unrest is often debated. In part, it was probably a response to economic conditions. In part, it was due to frustration with the slow progress being made by the parliamentary approach via the Labour Party. In part, it was due to the rather conservative leadership within the trade unions, which failed to inspire the membership. In part, it may have been inspired by ideology emanating from an emerging working class intelligentsia. One could argue that the establishment contributed to creating the problem with such moves as the Taff Vale judgment, which ruled that a trade union could be sued and compelled to pay for damages inflicted by its officials. By discouraging official strike action, did this inflame unofficial action? Similarly, the constitutional approach via Parliament was not facilitated by the Osborne judgment, under which trade unions were forbidden to levy the membership for political purposes. The Osborne judgment was made in 1909 and reversed by the Trade Union Act in 1913, so the ruling was essentially coterminous with the Great Unrest. However, this rather neat-sounding explanation can be countered by noting that trade union activity was considerably liberalised by the 1906 Trade Disputes Act. The role of syndicalism in the Great Unrest has been much debated also. Syndicalism, in its usual form of anarcho-syndicalism, is a socialist doctrine originating in continental Europe, in which political parties are done away with and each industry is put in the hands of a single controlling syndicate of workers. It differs from Marxism in avoiding putting political power in a workers' party, believing that state power always corrupts. It is therefore a form of anarchism. Political power is won by the workers staging a general strike and deploying violence and sabotage as necessary. The site Union History expresses the role of syndicalism in the Great Unrest thus: trade union membership grew rapidly between 1910 and 1914. This growth, a product of the extraordinary militancy of the pre-war years, exploded in a huge wave of strike action dubbed the Great Unrest. The printers' strike of 1911 was the occasion for the establishment of a new workers' daily newspaper in April 1912, the Daily Herald, edited by George Lansbury. The organisers of these pre-war strikes were hostile to the leadership of the industrial and political wings of the labour movement, which they condemned as class collaborationist. Instead, they were inspired by syndicalism. Syndicalists were a minority current in the labour movement, but nevertheless they offered a simple alternative to the continued employers' offensive, that of direct action, in order to regain some form of workers' control over workplace pay and conditions by utilising the strategy of the mass strike. While such a revolution did not ever become widespread in Britain, there is no doubt that syndicalist ideas abounded. The Manchester Syndicalist Education League, the Industrial Syndicalist Education League, and the Central Labour College in London all provided means of disseminating syndicalist ideas amongst intellectuals, trade unionists, and workers. The Industrial Syndicalist Education League, founded by Tom Mann, produced its own paper, The Industrial Syndicalist, and staged syndicalist conferences with international attendance. Some communist websites claim that, within months of Tom Mann founding the Industrial Syndicalist Education League, that the country would be gripped by a prolonged strike which was heavily influenced by their ideas. Such sites claim that, and I quote, "For many younger workers the appeal of syndicalism was in its rejection of political parties, combined with the argument that what the working class needed was new forms of union organisation, which did away with sectional organisation and replaced it with one union in one industry. The strength of syndicalism lies in the recognition that worker strength lies at the point of production, i.e. the workplace, whilst its weakness is in its rejection of political struggle. For syndicalists, the point is that capitalism will be replaced after workers have staged a general strike and have taken control of the workplace. Many who tried to overcome the shortcomings of existing unions embraced syndicalism. They pushed for the amalgamation of unions within the same industry and a militant policy of no compromise with the bosses. In Durham, the miners took syndicalist ideas into the coalfields to challenge the Conservative union leadership. In the railway industry, there was a paper, The Syndicalist Railwayman. According to a University of the West of England website, and referring to Bristol, there is evidence that some workers were sympathetic to the syndicalist movement. The syndicalist paper Solidarity seems to have had a favourable reception in Bristol. It was available at a newsagent's in the Horse Fair, as well as being sold directly by syndicalist agitators. Bristol could also provide a speaker, a clerk by the name of Herbert Eadie, to advocate the syndicalist cause. The strikes were often marked by violent confrontation. The most famous was the Tony Pandy riot in November 1910, during which South Wales miners attacked shops and mining officials' houses in the town of Tony Pandy. In Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, railwaymen were assisted in acts of sabotage by miners. In Chesterfield, strikers set the railway station on fire and were dispersed with bayonet charges. In Llanelli, striking railway workers were fired upon by troops and 2 men were killed. Troops also shot and killed 2 men during strikes in Liverpool. In 1911, there was the Seamen's strike, the London Dockers strike and the railway strike. The latter involved not far short of 200,000 men. There was a South Wales coal strike in 1910 and again in 1911, and then a national miners' strike in 1912, which involved some 850,000 men. In response to the 1910 South Wales miners' strike, Winston Churchill, as Home Secretary, dispatched infantry and cavalry. However, he thought better of sending them against the miners and had them stop at Swindon and Cardiff to stand by. The Metropolitan Police were deployed instead. As often happens when police confront strikers, the former came in for criticism for going too far. Churchill faced this criticism in Parliament, notably from Keir Hardie. But he was also criticised in the Times for not being tough enough. There is no approbation to be had in such circumstances. The 1911 Liverpool seamen's strike again provoked a military response, with 2 gunboats being sent up the Mersey. And again, troops were deployed in connection with the 1911 rail strike to assist strikebreakers keeping the trains running. The authorities certainly viewed the level and intensity of labour unrest extremely seriously. On at least one occasion, the military in Bristol fired over the heads of workers, said to be 1,000 strong, attacking a signal box which was being operated by strikebreakers. Walter Kendall, in his 1969 book The Revolutionary Movement in Britain 1900 to 1921, notes, "The trade union leaders, almost to a man, deplored it. The government viewed it with alarm. The Independent Labour Party regretted this untoward disregard for the universal panacea of the ballot box. The Social Democratic Federation asked, can anything be more foolish, more harmful, more unsocial than a strike? Yet disregarding everything, encouraged only by a small minority of syndicalist leaders, the great strike wave rolled on, threatening to sweep everything away before it." Leon Trotsky opined, "In August 1911, a general strike developed on the railways. During those days, a dim spectre of revolution hung over Britain." Whilst these actions of working men were anti-parliamentary in nature, that can be viewed as frustration with being still unable to influence the parliamentary process effectively due to being disenfranchised. The Labour Party was, obviously, to become a far greater political force once working people had the vote. To view the female suffrage era in isolation from these male-led events of even greater ferocity is to distort the history beyond the possibility of any true understanding. The male working class struggle was in truth at its height. One might guess that the British establishment was rather relieved to be able to dispatch these Bolshevik workers to the trenches of World War I. Who knows what might have transpired else? And the memory of the Great Unrest must surely have played a part just 4 years later when the franchise was back on the agenda with a vengeance.